Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to get into something pretty fundamental, a real bottleneck when we try to get large language models to handle massive amounts of text.
Right. We're talking about those super long sequences, maybe whole documents or long conversations.
Exactly. And standard transformer models, well, they really struggle. They hit this wall because of their quadratic scaling in time and memory. It gets really expensive really fast.
It really does. As we push for models that can genuinely understand, very long context, this quadratic complexity becomes a major roadblock. Double the length, quadruple the compute. It's not sustainable for truly large-scale data.
Okay, so that's the problem. Long sequences are tough for standard transformers. What's the new approach we're diving into today?
We're looking at the Fourier Transformer. It's a really neat architecture designed specifically for efficiency.
Fourier Transformer, okay?
Yeah, and the core idea, the really clever part, is about progressively finding and basically removing redundancy in the hidden states as the data goes through the model layers.
Removing redundancy. That sounds smart. How does it actually work?
Well, the main tool they use is something called the Discrete Cosine Transformation, or DCT.
DCT, okay.
Think of it like this. It takes the sequence of hidden states and sort of decomposes it into different frequency components, like splitting light with a prism.
Ah, okay. So you're looking at the sequence in terms of frequencies instead of just time step.
Precisely. And once it's in the frequency domain, they use what they call a spectral filter.
Spectral filter.
Right. It has three steps, basically. First, the DCT itself, transforming it. Second, and this is key, they truncate it. They chop off some of the higher frequency components.
Why the high frequencies?
Good question. They looked at pre-trained models like Roberta and analyzed the energy across frequencies in the hidden states, the power spectrum. They found that deeper into the model, most of the energy, the important information, tends to concentrate in the lower frequency bins.
Interesting. So the high frequency stuff becomes less critical as you go deeper?
It seems that way. It suggests more local correlation, more redundancy that can potentially be removed. So they filter out those high frequencies based on a set ratio.
Like compressing the signal, focusing on the main parts?
Exactly. And the third step is just reversing the process, the inverse DCT or IDCT, to go back to the time domain, but now with a shorter compressed representation because those high frequencies are gone.
So transform cut, transform back, leaving a more compact representation for the next layer.
That's the essence of it. It helps focus on the broader structure, which might be more important for long sequences than tiny high-frequency details.
Makes sense. But isn't calculating the DCT itself computationally intensive? Like, isn't that potentially ON2?
Yes, a direct DCT calculation can be slow, but here's another really smart innovation. They don't compute the DCT directly.
Okay.
They use the Fast Fourier Transform algorithm, the FFT.
Right, FFT is used everywhere, signal processing, images.
Exactly, and it turns out you can reformulate the DCT calculation to use the FFT operator, and the FFT is much faster.
How much faster?
We're talking ON log n complexity instead of ON2. That's a huge theoretical improvement, and in practice, FFTs are incredibly optimized.
Okay, so using FFT to do the DCT work makes the whole filtering process actually efficient.
Precisely. ON log n is way better. It parallelizes well, potentially OA log n, on parallel hardware, and it's already available in standard libraries. No need for custom hardware or weird kernels. It makes deployment much easier.
Faster, easier to implement. Nice. Now, one thing that really stood out to me was this idea of inheriting weights from existing pre-trained models. How does the Fourier Transformer manage that? That seems like a big deal.
It is a huge deal, and it works because the core transformations, the DCT and IDCT, are linear and perfectly reversible.
Okay.
And crucially, the fundamental self-attention mechanism of the transformer, it's still there. They haven't fundamentally ripped out the core engine. So you can take a big pre-trained model like BART and just plug its weights into the Fourier transformer architecture.
So unlike other efficient methods that might introduce totally new attention types.
Exactly. Many other approaches change the architecture so much that you have to pre-train them from scratch, which, as you know, takes massive data sets, huge amounts of compute, often impractical for many people.
Yeah, completely prohibitive sometimes. So being able to leverage, say, BART's weights is like getting a massive head start.
A massive head start. You're building on billions of parameters already trained on vast amounts of data.
Okay, that's a really key practical advantage. Now, how does this approach handle different kinds of tasks, like classification versus generation?
It adapts pretty smoothly. For encoder-only tasks, like classification, where you just need one final representation, the compressed sequence coming out of the encoder layers can be handled in standard ways.
Like pooling or using the CLS token?
Exactly. Mean pooling over the shortened sequence, or taking the CLS token embedding if you're inheriting from something like BERT or Redurta. standard stuff.
And for encoder-decoder tasks, like summarization or translation, where you need to generate a sequence.
Right. There, you need to be a bit more careful because the decoder needs to attend to the encoder's output, and it needs that positional information.
So you can't just feed it the short sequence.
Well, what they do is they take the shorter hidden sequences from the encoder blocks, and they upsample them back to the original input length.
Upsample, how?
Using something simple and parameter-free, like nearest neighbor interpolation. And importantly, they take the upsampled hidden states from all the encoder blocks, sum them up, and then feed that complete representation to the decoder.
Ah, okay. So compress inside the encoder for efficiency, but then reconstruct the full-length representation for the decoder to work with properly.
Precisely. It preserves the positional resolution needed for that cross-attention mechanism between the encoder and decoder.
Clever. Now, the paper also mentions something called further pre-training. Why do that if you've already inherited weights?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you can just inherit weights and then fine-tune directly on your task. And that works pretty well.
Okay.
But they found that doing a bit more pre-training after inheriting weights, but before fine-tuning, they call it Fourier BART FP for further pre-train, actually boosts performance even more.
Why would that help?
The thinking is it probably helps the model kind of settle in, adapt more fully to the specific architectural changes like the spectral filtering and the upsampling before it focuses on the final downstream task, fine-tuning the fit, essentially.
And I assume this further pre-training is much cheaper than training from scratch.
Oh, massively cheaper. The paper gives an example with BART large. Further pre-training took about 10 gigabytes of data and maybe 4 days on a few GPUs.
Okay. And from scratch.
Pre-training BART large from scratch, they estimate something like 160 gigabytes of data and maybe 1,000 GPU days.
Wow. Okay, that's orders of magnitude difference. That really drives home the efficiency point.
Absolutely. It makes adapting these large models much more accessible.
So let's talk results. How does this actually perform, especially on those long sequence benchmarks?
Right. So on the encoder-only side, they tested it extensively on the long-range arena benchmark LRA.
Which is designed specifically for these long context problems, right? Text, images as sequences, pathfinding.
Exactly. And the Fourier Transformer achieved state-of-the-art results there. It significantly outperformed previous top models on most of the tasks in that suite.
State of the art is impressive. What about speed and memory?
Also very impressive. On the LRA text task, compared to a standard transformer, they saw huge speedups and memory savings, especially as sequences got longer. For instance, at a length of 4096 tokens.
Yeah.
A 17.7 times speedup compared to the standard transformer. And big memory reductions, too.
17.7x. That's not just faster. That makes things possible that were maybe impossible before.
Exactly. It opens the door to processing truly long documents or interactions in a practical way.
Okay, that's encoder only. What about the encoder-decoder tasks like summarization?
There, the results were also very strong. Using Fourier BART, especially the further pre-trained version, Fourier BART FP, they outperformed standard BART and other efficient models on things like CN DailyMail summarization and ELI5 long-form QA.
Outperformed in terms of quality, like Rouge scores?
Yes, higher Rouge scores, better F1 scores on EI5. And importantly, they did this while using significantly fewer computations, fewer FLOPs.
How much fewer?
On CN DailyMail, about 1.6 times fewer FLOPs than a comparable BART model. On ELI5, with 70% truncation, it was closer to 1.9 times fewer FLOPs.
So better results and less computation. That's ideal.
It really is. You're getting efficiency without sacrificing and sometimes even gaining performance.
They also look at that retaining ratio, right? How much you chop off. How sensitive is the model to that?
Yeah, they did an ablation study. And interestingly, the model seems quite robust. On ELI5, performance stayed pretty good, even when they kept only 30% of the frequency components.
Only 30%. Wow.
Yeah, you had to cut down much more aggressively than that before performance really started to drop off noticeably.
So it gives you a good bit of flexibility there in tuning the efficiency versus accuracy trade-off. You don't have to pinpoint some exact tiny value.
Right. It's not super brittle, which is good news for a practical application.
Okay, sounds very promising, but no approach is perfect. What are the main limitations mentioned?
The primary one is that the speedups in encoder-decoder tasks, while present, aren't quite as dramatic as in the encoder-only setting.
Why is that?
It basically comes down to the autoregressive nature of decoding. When generating text, you typically produce one token at a time, and each new token depends on the ones before it.
Ah, so it's inherently sequential. You can't parallelize the big coding in the same way you can parallelize processing the input.
Exactly. That step-by-step generation limits the overall acceleration you can get from the faster encoder. Optimizing the DCT filtering for that kind of incremental step-by-step decoding is apparently still a tough research problem.
Okay, so the bottleneck kind of shifts a bit during generation. Still faster overall because of the encoder, but not the huge multiples we saw in encoder-only tasks.
That's a good way to put it.
Understood. But even with that caveat, it seems like a really significant step forward.
Absolutely. To kind of wrap it up, the Fourier Transformer offers this really elegant way to handle long sequences efficiently. Using DCT via FFT to cut redundancy works surprisingly well.
Leading to less compute, less memory, state-of-the-art on LRA, great results on generation by reusing pre-trained weights.
Exactly. And it's relatively robust to how much you compress. The core insight, again, is exploiting that frequency domain property, the fact that deeper layers focus on lower frequencies.
It really started with that observation about redundancy and the power spectrum in existing models.
Precisely. That analysis paved the way for this frequency-based filtering approach. And they do mention that improving the encoder-decoder acceleration is an active area, so maybe we'll see even more gains there in the future.
Fascinating work. It really shows how understanding what's happening inside these complex models can lead to some really clever design improvements.
It does, and it leads to a final thought, maybe for you, our listener. How could these ideas, analyzing things in the frequency domain, looking for and removing redundancy, apply elsewhere? Maybe in other machine learning problems you work on, or just other areas where you deal with complex data or signals? As data just keeps getting bigger and more complex, finding ways to efficiently get at the core information is going to be crucial. What could models like this unlock as we try to make sense of ever larger data sets? Something to think about.